Good morning, and welcome to the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce's Mid-Year Economic and Political Outlook for Brazil. I am John Welch, Executive Director of the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, and on behalf of the Chamber, we wish you all health and happiness during this long-awaited summer. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the Financial Times for sponsoring this event.
Thank you, John, and good morning to all of you. Welcome to today's event. This is a fascinating time to look at Brazil, transitioning from the pandemic, one hopes, to the elections in 2022. We are fortunate to have with us an exceptional team to discuss these and other points, to bring us up to date with the outlook and the main challenges, both economic and political.
Thanks, Paulo, Drauzio, and John, for the invitation. Thanks, the Chamber, for the invitation. Well, I guess we may have a window of calm weather in Brazil during the second half. There is surprisingly strong activity when you look at what has happened in the second quarter. We may see GDP strong when it is released in the beginning of September. And when we look at the second half, we may have reopening driving growth with services contributing strongly during the second half. The fact that we haven't had such a strong impact of lower mobility in April and May regarding the activity of the second quarter doesn't reduce the impact, in my view, of a more frank reopening, probably starting in September, looking at the progress of vaccination that we have so far. This is because this will probably trigger a quicker recovery in the labor market, which has been lagging the recovery of output per se, with an important support for private consumption going forward. Private consumption has disappointed in the first quarter. I believe it to still come relatively weak in the second quarter, but for the second half, it will probably start contributing more. So probably consensus is right about growth this year. I believe consensus is slightly pessimistic about growth next year. I think there is a good chance that you spill over to the first half of 2022, part of this momentum that we'll see in the second half of the current year. And then in the second half of next year onwards, we start to converge back to what have been the mediocre trend growth of Brazil since the recession of 15 and 16. Next year we have elections, just to wrap up. I was looking at the FX volatility in years of elections since 2002. And one thing that caught my attention is that FX volatility is higher than the average FX volatility, only if the discussion in the campaign generates uncertainty. Unfortunately, I believe so in years where the discussion didn't generate uncertainty, we haven't seen a market's behavior that was statistically very different from the normal. Unfortunately, I believe that next year, the things that will be discussed during the campaign may bring uncertainty. We will probably discuss a lot the spending cap rule, more fiscal spending, and depending on who will be the main contenders, you could have a very polarized discussion.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be in this panel. Well, I will start my assessment here focusing on inflation. I understand that inflation, when it's high, it's showing that there is some mismanagement in the economic policy. So like the fever that rises when the doctor prescribes a wrong medication. So I'm concerned about inflation. And we see some, I would say, a decoupling from what we see in the international experience. We know that inflation is rising in globally, but the correlations with Brazilian inflation is weaker now. So we see this decoupling. Actually, it started by mid last year, and here's some just small comment here. It's interesting that we saw we were seeing since Temer's administration this high correlation between the Brazilian inflation cycle and the inflation cycle of peer countries, for example. And now we've been seeing this decoupling since mid last year. So it's a symptom, in my opinion, of a mismanagement in the economic policy. And the main reason is the fiscal stance. And of course, against the backdrop of a low growth potential in Brazil. And we have, for example, capacity utilization is not so low when we take, for example, manufacturing. We have probably in some sectors in some segments of sectors, for example, IT, probably high capacity utilization as well. We have this energy problem. In part, it's conjunctural, but in part is structural. So it's saying a lot about growth potential in Brazil. And of course, we have, although the unemployment rate is so high, definitely Brazil is struggling with the lack of human capital in some specific sectors. We see here and there some pressure coming from wages for qualified workers. So what I'm saying is that yes, unemployment is high, yes, indeed, but we cannot take that as a guarantee that inflation will decrease because there are other bottlenecks that we have to consider when we assess the GDP gap, right, and the growth potential, of course. Well, probably, I think it's fair to say that probably central bank went too far in the monetary easing. I myself, to be honest, I was critical on that. I think that the negative real interest rate was not good news for Brazil, but I think the problem is not exactly the central bank, although, as I said, I think they pushed too far, the easing. I think the problem definitely is on the fiscal side.
Thanks, Paulo, and thanks to the Chamber for the kind invitation. As always, it's a great pleasure to be here with all the great panelists today. I think just first to put it in perspective, globally, we've really come off a very challenging rating cycle. So if you look at 2020 and so far in 2021, we've had about 56 downgrades. So in this context, what I want to highlight is Brazil has so far escaped being downgraded, although it is on negative outlook. So first thing I would say is that obviously the challenge from a rating perspective has been for us is, it's been a very global and unprecedented shock. And we knew at the get-go that the global policy response to the pandemic is going to be a debt increase across the globe. So Brazil is not going to be an exception, in that regard. Now, when we started downgrading sovereigns through 2020 and into 2021, we started kind of looking at a framework, looking at, countries that are particularly sort of vulnerable, let's say, to, tourism or single commodity, or, what is the, headroom in the existing rating, what's been the track record of the government to consolidate fiscal accounts from a previous crisis. What's the commitment of the government to go back to consolidation, go back to an economic reform agenda after the pandemic, recedes, and also countries that actually entered the crisis with, shallower local markets, doubtful access to international markets, weaker fundamentals. These are the countries that actually got, downgraded and sometimes multiple notches. So we, at this point, obviously feel that Brazil really did not fit this sort of, framework of an outright downgrade. That said, we did put Brazil on a negative outlook last year, just because we started seeing downside risks to growth, public finances, debt trajectory in the context of Brazil's already limited fiscal space. We were also concerned about the reform outlook. We were not we were not sure whether the government would be able to, pick up, from where it left in terms of its reforms after the pandemic, given the fluidity of the political environment. So a year on, we have just affirmed the rating in May, but we've also sustained the negative outlook. So essentially, I think we see a fairly mixed picture, which has also been something that's been captured by Andre and Zena earlier as well. On the positive side, which is kind of underpinned, let's say, our rating affirmation has been economic rebound. We also think that economic growth is going to be about 5%. There probably is a bit of an upside of 5% growth for this year, although we do expect a pretty strong deceleration of, to about 2% next year. We also think that trend growth in Brazil remains below 2%, but the near term is looking good. Second, fiscal and debt picture did not deteriorate as sharply as we had projected last year. So I think we felt that, we were looking at fiscal deficits of about 16, 17% of GDP last year. We were looking at debt crossing 90% of GDP. All of that didn't happen, because of under execution of some of the fiscal support package. And what we now see is debt actually going to be declining this year, between 80 to 85% of GDP, perhaps on the back of some temporary factors, such as the higher nominal GDP growth, not only because of stronger rebound, but also high GDP deflator, BNDES paying back treasury over 1% of GDP, and clearly the withdrawal and the rolling off of some part of the, or of a sizable part of the fiscal package that was introduced last year. Thirdly, we also see some thawing in the domestic debt market sentiment, which is pretty key given that Brazil still has very large financing needs, and having access to the domestic market is very key. And what we are beginning to see is thawing in domestic debt market sentiment. Fourth, we would say external resilience, and not that we were ever concerned about Brazil's external accounts, but Brazil clearly again has demonstrated its ability to navigate choppy waters from an external perspective. We're seeing current account now pretty much in balance, perhaps this year, or maybe even a slight surplus. We are seeing foreign direct investment actually coming back after dipping last year. International reserves of over $350 billion provide ample international liquidity. And finally, I think resumption of economic reforms. I mean, I think that, in the first few months of this year, we noted, some progress on reform. I mean, somewhat diluted, such as the emergency bill, but at least nevertheless, we saw some progress there. We saw the electrobras privatization move in the legislature, in Congress as well. We saw some upgrading of regulatory frameworks in certain sectors to attract private investment in things like sanitation, for example. We also saw the central bank autonomy law getting passed as well.
Thank you very much, Paulo. It's a tremendous pleasure to be able to be here in such a distinguished panel. If I were to kind of summarize my main messages as to what I see on the political landscape, I think it would be one in which I'm less concerned about the political environment, over the course of the second half of this year, in terms of a deteriorating political environment that can more negatively impact fiscal accounts, or generate kind of, let's say, political events that can undermine an economic recovery or materially impact asset prices. But I'm more worried about the 2022 election. Why? It's interesting to kind of compare the current political moment to where we were just 3 or 4 months ago, right? If you look at the headlines right now in Brasilia, evidently we have a president that is at his worst moment from a political or public opinion point of view, right? You look at the president's approval ratings, his approval ratings, President Bolsonaro's approval ratings on a binary scale, approve, disapprove, is at around, anywhere from 32 to 34 percentage points. If you measure approval ratings on a 5-point scale, excellent, good, regular, bad, horrible, the excellent good numbers are around 24%, right? And the negatives have gone up, in a context where we have congressional investigations, underway, uncovering or examining allegations of impropriety within the Ministry of Health and potential kind of attempts for corruption in the purchase of vaccines, in a broader investigation over the management of the pandemic. So essentially we had a president who paid a large price from a public opinion point of view over the mismanagement of COVID in the first half of the year. It kind of got out of the peak of the COVID crisis in mid-April. The pandemic numbers started to improve. Then you have allegations of corruption in the Ministry of Health, and so the public associated corruption with mismanagement of COVID, and he took another small step downward, right? And in a context where the president is embattled, you know, there are some concerns over whether the president could potentially, you know, not respect the constitutional cap on spending, spend his way out of political trouble. And therefore, there's the whole discussion of whether the Bolsa Familia program that the government wants to increase will fit within the spending cap or not, right?
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you for the invitation. You know, it's a pleasure to be with such a brilliant group here of old-timers. I would say actually that when bringing to the table one point that Chris just mentioned right now, one of the big surprises we have right here in Brazil right now is the growth. If we had this meeting before, we would be talking here about fiscal cliff. You know, Brazil had a 10% fiscal deficit last year. It's going to be 2% this year, but people would say it would be 4%, and would be a major drag in fiscal terms, and growth would be very, very sluggish in Brazil in 2021. And actually, the big surprise we have so far is that, you know, until April, if you look at the Focus forecast for GDP growth in Brazil, it was around 2.5% and being revised down. And suddenly people start to revise it up, you know, up to 5.5%. So I think that's the big difference in Brazil right now. And I would start to get the scenario, you know, from this perspective. You know, one of my perceptions being, you know, a long time in the markets is that Brazil is almost like a leverage company. You know, when things go wrong, they go really wrong, and when things start to go right, they start to go really right. So starting from that, you know, this 5.5% growth, you know, the immediate surprise that we saw was in fiscal revenues that we have already mentioned here so many times. And with that, you know, the primary surplus that, again, using the Focus numbers, until March, April, they were estimated to be -3% in primary fiscal surplus deficit in the case, you know, and it was starting to be revised down to 4%. Right now, we have an estimate of -2% for 2021. And the IMF just came out with a forecast of -1.7% for 2021. So growth actually translated into better fiscal revenues, and this translated to a perception that, you know, the fiscal number is going to be much better in Brazil. So that was a very good externality of growth here in Brazil. If you take that, you know, and you translate it into the debt GDP numbers, you know, until, again, 6 months ago, we would be saying here that was 60, 70, 80, 90 would hit 100% of GDP and go to 110. The IFI numbers, you know, from the Independent Fiscal Authority here, research from the Senate was projecting numbers like that, you know. And actually the surprise was that went all the way up to 90% and then started to reduce to 87. The latest official number is 84. And here at Vinci, we have a forecast for the end of the year at 81%. If you take this 81% by the end of the year and you assume a scenario where very conservative primary surplus doesn't return until 2026, and you have an average growth of 2.5% and real interest rate for the gross debt is 3% real positive, you know, this number goes to 75% in 2030. In a longer span. So we have a declining scenario of debt GDP. I'm not including any number of privatization revenues that might occur or any sale of foreign exchange reserves in that forecast. So that's a conservative number.
We've been through waves of optimism and pessimism, and peak pessimism giving way to peak optimism globally until a month ago or so when we start to roll over. The same happened in Brazil, different timing. Brazil's past its wave of peak pessimism on fiscal and now peak optimism on growth. But I think we tend to forget the underlying trend, and I think Jose Carlos touched on that. By and large, the region in Brazil in particular follows the commodity cycle and probably won't be as higher an upturn as people expected for global growth and the commodity cycle, but it will be longer. So won't see the amplitude that people hope for, but I think it's better. I think it will take longer. It will extend in 2022. And this positive trend will continue to help Brazil. We have several headwinds, not to belittle them. Fiscals, and all highlighted fiscal inflation. And I think they will be concerning. And the uncertainty that the administration itself generates is hindering faster growth. But at the same time, this uncertainty is generating precautionary savings. And this higher savings, if you look at the path of savings in Brazil, has been a significant boost to savings on the back of these developments. And this is helping the balance of payments, because one is the flip side of the other. So I think, as Jose Carlos said, this helps the flows as well. And a lot is still parked offshore. So in light of this backdrop, where we have headwinds and inflation and fiscal unresolved, and I think will remain unresolved, and there's more work for the central bank to do. I doubt the central bank will stop, while the BRL is the most volatile, at least judging by implied vols, the most volatile currency in the world. I think they won't stop before that changes. I think we have work to do, but I think the underlying trend on growth is good.
Thank you, Drauzio. This was really a fascinating discussion. I turn it back now to John.
Well, thank you, Paulo, Drauzio, Andre, Zena, Shelley, Jose Carlos, and Chris for a great discussion. And thank you all for joining us today. And thanks to the Financial Times once again for sponsoring the event. Our next event, a happy hour organized by the young professionals of the Chamber, will take place on Thursday, the 12th of August at 5 p.m. Again, thank you all for coming, especially to our members. For those who are not, please watch the brief video that follows and consider joining the Chamber. Until then, stay happy, healthy, and in good spirits.